Let me be straight with you right now. Stop whatever you're doing, because what's unfolding in Berea, Ohio over these next few weeks is genuinely one of the most chaotic, most consequential, most emotionally loaded quarterback situations this league has seen in years. And that is not hyperbole. That is not a clickbait opener designed to get you to stick around for 30 seconds before Dre buries the lead. That is just the flat, unvarnished truth about what the Cleveland Browns are walking into as training camp opens and the football world starts paying attention again. We are talking about a franchise that has been searching for a real, legitimate, franchise-defining quarterback since before a significant portion of the people watching this video were old enough to remember a full NFL season. We are talking about a $230 million man who has played 19 total games in a Browns uniform and is now rehabbing from his second torn Achilles tendon, while the clock on his career ticks louder than ever. And we are talking about a fifth-round rookie who fell out of the first round on national television in front of millions of people, landed in the one city in America with the most notorious quarterback graveyard reputation in professional football, and proceeded to make every single team that passed on him look increasingly foolish with every rep he has gotten since. Deshaun Watson, Shedeur Sanders, two quarterbacks, one job. One city that has been waiting a generation for someone to finally answer the question that has haunted this franchise for decades, in a front office that, if we are being completely honest with each other, does not want to make this call, but is about to have training camp make it for them, whether they are ready or not. That is the scene. Now let's get into the story, because there is so much story here it almost does not fit into a single video. To understand why this moment feels so enormous for Browns fans, you have to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of this season, not the beginning of last season, but the beginning of the Watson era itself, because the weight of that decision is the thing that makes every single development in this quarterback room feel 10 times heavier than it would anywhere else in the league. When Cleveland traded for Deshaun Watson, they did not just make a personnel move, they made a statement, a loud, expensive, franchise-altering statement that said we are done cycling through journeymen and retreads and draft gambles that never pan out. We are going out and getting a proven, elite-level, former Pro Bowl quarterback, and we are handing him the keys to this offense, and we are never having this conversation again. That was the energy. That was the pitch ownership sold to the fan base, and that was the pitch the front office sold to themselves when they signed off on a fully guaranteed contract worth well over $200 million, a number that, at the time it was announced, made general managers around the league physically uncomfortable, not jealous, uncomfortable. Because the people who run NFL franchises for a living looked at that structure and understood immediately what it meant. It meant Cleveland had no exit ramp. It meant whatever happened next, however the Watson experiment played out, the Browns were financially strapped to that decision for years. There was no easy out, no graceful pivot, no clean escape clause that made the math work painlessly if things went sideways. They were all in, completely, irrevocably, all in. And then, things went sideways. Not immediately, not in some dramatic single moment that everyone could point to as the turning point. It happened gradually, the way these things usually do, in layers. First came the off-field controversy that had been swirling around Watson long before Cleveland ever entered the picture, the kind of noise that never fully goes away, no matter how many press conferences get held or how many carefully worded statements get released. Then came the on-field product, which was supposed to make all of that noise fade into the background the way great quarterback play has a way of doing in this league. It did not. The passer rating that would make a backup wince, the turnover issues that showed up at the worst possible moments, the offensive chemistry with his receivers and tight ends that never really developed into anything you could hang a game plan on with real confidence. The flashes were there, enough to keep the hope alive for a while, but the consistency that defines a true franchise quarterback, the kind Cleveland thought it was buying, never materialized in any sustained way.
And then came the injuries. The first Achilles tear was brutal enough on its own.
For any athlete, a torn Achilles is a serious, career-threatening injury that demands a full commitment to rehabilitation and carries genuine uncertainty about whether the player comes back at the same level of explosiveness and athleticism they had before it happened. For a quarterback who had already built his entire game around the kind of mobility and pocket escapability that made him a nightmare for defenses in Houston, the stakes of that injury were even higher. You need your legs. You need the threat of what you can do outside the pocket to keep safeties honest and open up the throws downfield that define that style of play. Lose the legs, and a significant portion of what makes you dangerous as a passer disappears with them. Watson fought back from it, went through the rehab, did everything publicly that you are supposed to do when you are a high-profile athlete trying to reclaim your standing in a sport that has no patience for prolonged absences. And then he tore the other one, the same injury, different leg, within a window that had already tested the patience of an entire city. 2 torn Achilles tendons on the same player is a medical reality that carries implications that go beyond just the physical recovery. It raises questions about durability that do not have comfortable answers. It raises questions about what a 30-year-old quarterback looks like on the back end of that kind of injury history, when the game has a way of finding every weakness you have and attacking it without mercy. And it places this entire training camp situation in a context that makes the stakes feel almost impossibly high for a guy who has not played a full, meaningful NFL game in longer than most people can keep track of. That is the Watson side of this equation, and now you need to understand the other side, because the other side of this story is where it gets genuinely, compellingly, can't look away fascinating. Shadur Sanders was not supposed to be a Cleveland Brown, at least not the version of Shedeur Sanders that the draft world was discussing heading into the spring. The version of Shadur Sanders that mock drafts were projecting, that national analysts were debating, that NFL teams were flying out to Colorado to evaluate on campus, was a first-round pick. Not a fringe first-rounder, not a guy sneaking in at 31 or 32, but a legitimate top-5 conversation quarterback who played under the biggest spotlight college football has produced in recent years and had the tape to justify the hype. His father is a Hall of Famer who coached him. The program at Colorado was a national storyline from the moment Deshaun Sanders arrived in Boulder. Every game, every throw, every press conference, every social media post was covered with the kind of intensity that most college programs never experience at any point in their existence, let alone week after week for multiple seasons. Shadur Sanders did not just survive that circus, he thrived inside it. He played some of the best college quarterback football in the country while the cameras never left, while the critics never stopped, while the expectations never lowered by a single inch. That is not nothing. That is actually a very difficult thing to do, and it tells you something real about the makeup of the person doing it. And then draft night arrived, and something happened that turned what should have been a celebration into one of the most talked about stories the NFL offseason has produced in years. Team after team passed, round after round went by. The names being called were not Shedeur Sanders. Hours passed. The first round ended, he was still sitting there. Day 2 came and went, still there. By the time it was over, a quarterback who had been projected by a significant portion of the scouting community as a top 5 talent had fallen all the way to the 5th round. Round 5, pick 244 overall. For context, more than 240 players were selected before a kid who, on tape, most analysts believed was a first-round quarterback. The theories started immediately. Every sports show, every podcast, every analyst with a platform had their explanation for why it happened. Some pointed to perceived attitude concerns. Some pointed to scheme fit questions. Some pointed to the complicated dynamics of being coached by a famous parent and whether that created evaluation blind spots or biases in NFL front offices. The full truth of why Shadur Sanders fell that far on that night may never be completely confirmed publicly, and it probably includes a combination of factors that varied from team to team rather than one clean explanation. But here is what that slide did to Shedeur Sanders that no draft position could ever manufacture artificially. It gave him a chip, a real, deep, personal, career-defining chip on his shoulder that you cannot buy, cannot fake, and cannot instill through any coaching technique or motivational speech in any film room anywhere in the world. Every quarterback selected in the first round ahead of him is a name he carries with him. Every team that sat on their hands when his name was available is an organization he remembers. Every analyst who questioned his game or offered a theory about why he was not worth a first-round pick is a take he has filed away. That kind of fuel burns differently than the motivation that comes from success. Success is comfortable. Getting passed over in front of the entire country on national television is a wound that either breaks a person or builds them into something harder than they were before. Based on what Shedeur Sanders showed as a rookie, it appears to be doing the second thing, and that matters enormously for everything that is about to unfold in Cleveland. When Sanders actually got on the field as a rookie, the conversation shifted quickly from questions about why he fell to questions about what the Browns had actually found. Because the tape from his rookie season told a story that the raw numbers alone did not fully capture. And that distinction is important if you want to actually understand what Cleveland has in this kid, rather than just skimming the surface of a stat line. He threw for over 1,400 yards in 8 games. He threw 7 touchdown passes. He showed the kind of pocket presence and willingness to stand in and deliver the football against pressure that you cannot fully teach a quarterback who does not already have it somewhere inside them. He made throws under duress with defenders in his face that many rookie quarterbacks would have simply given up on. He read defenses well enough that there were stretches where Browns fans, sitting in the stands of a stadium that has hosted more quarterback disasters than almost any other venue in professional football, were genuinely excited watching their quarterback play. That does not happen accidentally. That does not happen because a kid got lucky for a few weeks. That happens because the talent is real. But Dre is not here to paint a perfect picture, because a perfect picture would be dishonest, and dishonesty does not serve you. The 10 interceptions are real. That number needs to be addressed directly and not explained away, because 10 picks in 8 games is a significant volume of turnovers that opposing defensive coordinators around the league have already circled and built portions of their game plan philosophy around heading into 2026. It is a real problem. It is the most significant weakness on his resume coming out of year 1, and it is the thing that Watson supporters will point to, correctly, when making the case that handing this franchise to a rookie with ball security issues is a gamble the organization cannot afford. Here is where Dre parts ways with that argument, though, and it is an important distinction. There's a fundamental difference between the type of interception a rookie quarterback throws and the type of interception a veteran quarterback with years of professional experience throws. A rookie seeing a safety rotate late for the first time at NFL speed and making a decision half a second too slow is a processing issue. It's a timing issue. It's the kind of mistake that happens when the game is still moving faster than your mental model of it, and your eyes have not yet learned to anticipate what your experience has not yet given you. Those interceptions are fixable. They are the specific kind of mistake that year 2 almost always cures as the game slows down mentally and the patterns stop feeling new. Every quarterback who has ever cleaned up their turnover numbers from year 1 to year 2 has benefited from exactly this phenomenon. Watson's turnovers carry no such excuse. He is not learning the speed of professional football. He has been playing in this league for years. If the ball security problems that showed up in his time in Cleveland are still present when he gets on the field this summer, that is not a processing issue. That is not something a year of experience will fix. That is a characteristic of his game at this stage of his career, and franchises that ignore that distinction have a history of paying for the mistake in the standings. The public-facing voices around this quarterback battle have told 3 completely different stories depending on which level of the organization you're listening to, and reading the gap between those stories is where the real truth lives.
Start at the top.
Owner Jimmy Haslam stood in front of reporters at a league meeting and threw his public support behind Deshaun Watson in terms that were unambiguous and deliberate. Fresh start, new coaching staff, Watson down to one of his lightest playing weights in recent memory. The implication was clear. This time is different. This time, the body is right, the mind is right, and the situation around him is finally the right environment to unlock the version of Deshaun Watson that justified every dollar of that contract. And Dre understands exactly why Haslam said what he said, because the math of the alternative is brutal. When you have publicly guaranteed a player $230 million, publicly questioning that investment from a podium with cameras rolling is not just an admission of error, it is an organizational earthquake. It shakes the confidence of every other player, coach, and front office employee in your building about the decision-making capability of the people running the franchise. Owners do not do that. They protect the narrative, even when the evidence is eroding it, because protecting the narrative is also protecting the value of the franchise itself. So yes, Haslam said what he said, but Dre's honest read is that quote reflects what ownership needs to believe publicly, not necessarily what the practice field is actually revealing behind closed doors. Drop one level to general manager Andrew Berry, and the tone shifts in a way that is genuinely revealing if you listen carefully enough. Berry, when pressed directly about the quarterback competition, did not echo the certainty that ownership projected. He talked about competition. He talked about earning roles. He said Watson and Sanders are, quote, no different in that regard when it comes to having to prove themselves in camp. Think about those words for a second. Actually sit with them, because no general manager who is truly locked in on a $230 million investment as his unquestioned starting quarterback uses that framing. You do not equate your franchise cornerstone with a fifth-round rookie in terms of what each of them needs to prove, unless genuine uncertainty exists about which one of them gives you the best chance to win. Berry is a careful, measured communicator. He does not make careless statements, which means that statement was not careless. It was a deliberately diplomatic acknowledgement that this competition is real, that the outcome is not predetermined, and that the front office is watching training camp with genuinely open eyes rather than a settled conclusion already reached. And then there's the analyst community, the national voices who watch tape for a living, who have sources inside multiple organizations, and who have no financial or political reason to protect anybody's feelings in a Cleveland front office. That community has been increasingly direct about where they see this heading. Multiple credible voices have come out and said variations of the same thing. Watson's combination of injury history, statistical underperformance, and the reputational baggage that has accumulated during his tenure in Cleveland makes it genuinely difficult to build a season plan around him with real confidence. One analyst was blunt enough to say he simply does not believe Watson has a realistic chance of winning this job, pointing to the length of his absence from the field, the stacked Achilles injuries, and what he described as eroded credibility in the locker room as the primary reasons. That is not a fan venting frustration on social media. That is a credentialed professional who gets paid to evaluate NFL quarterbacks, saying on record in plain language that he does not think Watson wins this competition. When multiple voices with actual access to this league are converging on the same read independently, that stops being opinion and starts becoming the informed consensus, whether the Browns want to acknowledge it or not. And then there's the four-quarterback room, because this detail gets lost in the Watson versus Sanders debate, and it absolutely should not. Cleveland heading into camp with 4 total arms at the quarterback position is not a show of organizational depth, it is a signal of organizational anxiety. You stack a position group that deep when you are not confident in your top options. You add bodies because somewhere in that front office, somebody looked at the 2 names at the top of the depth chart and decided they needed insurance against a scenario where neither one works out the way they needed to. That is damage control dressed up as roster building. And given everything this franchise has been through at the quarterback position over the last 20-plus years, the impulse is understandable.
but it also tells you everything about the confidence level, or lack thereof, that exists inside that building right now.
Let's put the actual numbers side by side, because Dre promised you honesty, and honesty requires looking at the full picture without flinching. Deshaun Watson has played 19 games as a Cleveland Brown. 19. For a player who received the richest fully guaranteed quarterback contract in NFL history at the time it was signed, 19 games is an almost staggering under-delivery in terms of availability alone, before you even get to performance. In those 19 games, his passer rating sits just below 81. By modern NFL standards, an 81 passer rating is not a franchise cornerstone number. It is a number that gets a backup quarterback benched in most organizations. He has thrown 19 touchdowns against 12 interceptions, producing just over 3,000 total passing yards. The math on what Cleveland spent to acquire and pay him versus what they have received in return is not a close calculation. It is one of the most significant mismatches between investment and production in recent memory at the position. Sanders played 8 games. He threw for 1,400+ yards, 7 touchdowns, 10 interceptions, finishing with a 68 passer rating on the season. The 68 sits below Watson's 81, and Watson's supporters will use that number as the anchor of their argument that Sanders is not ready. But here is the layer underneath that number that changes the conversation entirely. Sanders compiled those numbers as a 5th-round rookie in his first professional season behind an offensive line that was by most accounts one of the weakest units in the league. Without the benefit of an established system, a proven coordinator building around his strengths, or the runway that a proper quarterback development situation would have provided. Watson compiled his numbers as a veteran quarterback with years of professional experience, full access to the team's resources, and the kind of organizational infrastructure built around his success that a franchise gives to a $230 million investment. When a 5th-round rookie starter who is learning professional football in real time is producing numbers that are even in the same conversation as a fully paid veteran, the trajectory is telling you something the raw statistics are not. The interception volume from Sanders in year 1 is the legitimate concern. 10 in 8 games is a real number, with real implications for how opposing defenses will approach him in year 2. But the research on rookie quarterback development is consistent on one thing. Ball security is one of the most reliably improved metrics from year 1 to year 2 for quarterbacks who process the game well at a foundational level. The mental processing catches up, the eyes get faster, the recognition of safety rotations and disguised coverages becomes automatic rather than effortful. The question is not whether Sanders threw too many interceptions as a rookie. He did. The question is whether the underlying tools and football intelligence are present at a level that makes those interceptions a correctable problem rather than a permanent one. And the tape from his rookie season suggests the answer to that question leans toward yes, which is not something you can say with any confidence about whatever turnover issues persist with a quarterback who has been in the league as long as Watson has. The coaching staff question might actually be the most important variable in this entire situation, and it consistently gets less attention than the contract numbers and the draft slide narrative. Because what a new coaching regime wants, what it needs to establish quickly to have any chance of succeeding, shapes everything about how this quarterback decision ultimately gets made. This is a brand new staff walking into Cleveland, and new staffs in the NFL operate under a specific and urgent pressure that veterans of the league understand immediately. You need your locker room to believe in you. You need the players in that building to look at you and see people who know what they are doing, who have a plan, and who are going to execute that plan with conviction, rather than hedging every decision for the sake of avoiding blame. Trust is the currency of successful coaching staffs, and trust is established through clarity, through commitment, through the willingness to make a hard call and stand behind it, even when it becomes uncomfortable. The previous regime in Cleveland attempted to manage the Watson and Sanders situation by splitting the difference, by keeping both viable.
by rotating and hoping the answer would reveal itself without anyone having to be the one to officially close the competition. That strategy failed in a way that was visible and painful for everyone watching. It fractured chemistry. It created uncertainty that permeated the entire offense. It put both quarterbacks in a psychological no-man's land where neither could fully commit to the mental habits of a starter because neither knew when the next week might bring a change. Offensive rhythms require repetition. They require a quarterback who knows the game plan is being built around him and who can practice the same scenarios until they become muscle memory rather than conscious decision-making. You cannot build that kind of rhythm in a revolving door environment. The previous staff tried, and the results were on display for the entire league to see.
A new coaching staff that watched that experiment fail and is now walking into the same building with the same two quarterbacks has essentially one sensible option if it wants to avoid repeating the disaster. Pick one. Commit to one. Build the offense around one quarterback's strengths, develop the game plan around what that quarterback does best, and give the chosen player the psychological security of knowing the job is his to lose through his own performance, rather than through a coaching staff decision that could come at any moment. That is how you build a functional offense. That is how you establish trust with a locker room. And that is how you give yourself the best possible chance of not being the third consecutive coaching staff to implode in Cleveland over a quarterback situation that never got properly resolved. Now, the realistic outcome in the short term may not perfectly reflect the sensible outcome, because the NFL is a business, and businesses are not always run on pure football logic, particularly when $230 million of guaranteed money is sitting in one player's contract. An admission of a mistake carries enormous reputational and financial implications for the people in charge. Watson gets the benefit of the doubt in camp because of the money. He gets more runway than his performance level would earn him in a purely meritocratic evaluation because the organization has too much invested in needing him to be the answer to simply walk away from that narrative after one difficult stretch of training camp practices. That is the sunk cost fallacy at work. It is irrational from a pure competition standpoint, and it is almost certainly going to influence the initial Week 1 decision, even if the practice field is telling a different story. But here is the part of that scenario that matters. The leash that comes attached to Watson if he opens the season as the starter will be the shortest leash any $230 million quarterback has ever been given in the history of professional football. Because this fan base is not patient. This fan base has seen this movie before, and this fan base watched a fifth-round rookie outperform their enormous investment last season, to the degree that they were chanting the rookie's name in the stadium while the veteran was on the sideline. You cannot unsee that. You cannot unfeel that. And the moment Watson's struggles resurface, the moment the turnover issues show up again, or the pocket presence looks compromised by his injury history, that stadium is going to make its feelings known in a way that cannot be ignored, and that places this new coaching staff in an impossible position in real time on national television. Coaches say they do not make decisions based on crowd noise. Coaches who are honest about their job security know that crowd noise eventually becomes owner noise, and owner noise eventually becomes a phone call they cannot avoid. There is a narrative floating around the edges of this conversation that Dre needs to address directly because it keeps resurfacing in comment sections and on sports talk radio, and in the kind of takes that sound reasonable on the surface until you actually think them through. The idea that maybe it is better for Shadur Sanders to sit, to learn, to absorb everything from the sideline for a stretch of games before taking on the full responsibility of the starting position, to let Watson take the hits, physical and reputational, while Sanders develops quietly in the background before stepping in at some later, more convenient moment. That logic sounds protective of the young player. It sounds like patience dressed up as wisdom, and it is, respectfully, completely wrong about how quarterback development actually works in this league. Development does not happen on the sideline. It does not happen in film sessions alone, or in walkthrough practices, or in holding a clipboard and watching someone else make decisions in real time while defenses react around them.
Development happens on the field, with live defenders, with genuine consequences, with a play clock running, and a defense disguising its coverage, and a crowd making noise, and an offensive line under pressure, and a tight end running a route at NFL speed that looks completely different from anything the college game prepared you for. You learn to process those situations by experiencing those situations. There is no substitute, and there is no shortcut, and there is no veteran quarterback in the history of professional football who can teach a young quarterback what standing in the pocket and delivering the ball under pressure actually feels like as a lived experience rather than an observed one.
Every week Shadur Sanders spends holding a clipboard is a week of real, irreplaceable development that does not come back. He is not banking patience, he is losing time, he is losing reps, he is losing the specific, painful, instructive football education that only comes from getting knocked around by NFL defenses and having to figure out in real time how to adjust, how to protect the football better, how to read the field faster, how to build the kind of toughness that only adversity at the professional level actually creates. You cannot store that experience for later. You either accumulate it when you are young and your mind is most adaptable, or you arrive at the next stage of your development without the foundation that should have been built earlier. And there is a perception risk here that goes beyond the immediate question of development. If Sanders spends this season as a backup, if he becomes the guy who the Browns clearly want but never fully commit to, if he develops a reputation around the league as a talented player who his own organization does not fully believe in, that perception has consequences. It shapes how opposing coaches discuss him. It shapes how future organizations evaluate him if the Cleveland situation ever changes. Perception is not everything in this business, but it is more than nothing. And the worst version of this situation for Shedeur Sanders is not losing the competition cleanly. It is the competition dragging on unresolved for months while neither quarterback ever gets a genuine, sustained opportunity to prove himself or fail on his own terms. Step back far enough from the day-to-day noise of training camp reports and practice leaks and anonymous front office sourcing, and you see what this decision is actually about. And it is so much larger than a Week 1 depth chart. It is so much bigger than one game against Jacksonville or whatever the opening schedule looks like. It is the entire direction of this franchise for the next 5 to 10 years, depending on how the next few months unfold. If Cleveland gets this right, if they correctly read what the tape and the practice field and the honest medical assessment of both quarterbacks is telling them, and if they make the decision that gives them the best real chance to build something sustainable rather than the decision that is easiest to defend in a press conference, this franchise breaks the cycle. The cycle that has made the Cleveland Browns quarterback position the punchline of a league-wide joke for 2 full decades. The cycle of retreads and reclamation projects, and expensive gambles that never paid off, and draft picks that flashed promise before disappearing. They break it with a young quarterback who has already proven he has the toughness and the talent to grow into the role if given the opportunity, and they build around him the way franchises that have figured out the quarterback position build, with patience and commitment and the willingness to absorb short-term growing pains for the sake of long-term stability. If they get it wrong, if the sunk cost thinking wins, if ownership pressure or financial logic or fear of a public reckoning with a failed $230 million investment shapes this decision more than the actual evidence on the practice field, Cleveland resets. Everything resets. The fan frustration that has been building for years gets a new chapter. The quarterback carousel starts spinning again. And 2 or 3 years from now, a different voice on a different channel is doing a different version of this breakdown, with different names attached to the same basic story that Cleveland has been telling about itself at the quarterback position before most of its current players were teenagers. The Browns are standing at a crossroads that is real and significant and overdue. One path leads somewhere new, the other path leads back to the beginning. The only question is whether the people making this decision have the clarity and the courage to take the right one, regardless of how uncomfortable it makes the financial ledger look on paper. Deshaun Watson, Shedeur Sanders.
230 million reasons to get this wrong, one very important reason to get it right. A city that has been waiting long enough to deserve the real answer, not the politically convenient one. Training camp is here. The reps are being taken, the tape is being evaluated, and the decision that comes out of Berea over these next few weeks is going to define what the Cleveland Browns are for a very long time. Now it's your turn. Are you backing Watson to pull off one more comeback, defy the injury odds, and silence every critic who wrote him off? Or are you ready to hand this thing to Shadur Sanders and let the kid who fell to the 5th round show the rest of the league exactly how bad a mistake they made on draft night? Drop your take in the comments. Get into it. Tag someone who has a different opinion and make them defend it. And if this breakdown gave you anything worth thinking about, hit that like button because it genuinely matters for this channel more than you might realize. Subscribe to stay locked in on every development through training camp and into the season, because this story is not close to finished. The best parts are still coming.